We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. In light of the huge U.S. tariffs imposed on China, Chinese officials announced this week that the country, quote, no longer needs energy or agricultural exports from the United States. Professor Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Brian. Glad to be here.
Well, the issues here, Richard, related to the economy, to global trade, couldn't be more impactful. Of course, they're impactful on China, especially impactful on global South countries that are basically living inside of an export-driven economy that's dependent on the U.S. market. Of course, they're facing huge unemployment if these tariffs go through. But China also is retaliating, and China says we're big enough, we're developed enough, we're committed enough that we're not going to be bullied by Trump. I want to read to you a little bit from the Financial Times. Chinese official Zhao said that U.S. agricultural imports were, quote, primarily for feed grains, which were highly substitutable, meaning they could be replaced, and noted that there would be a limited impact on China's energy supplies if companies had to stop importing American oil, natural gas, and coal. The loss of the Chinese market would be a substantial hit, though, for U.S. farmers who shipped roughly $33 billion of agricultural goods to China in 2023. The U.S. also sent about $15 billion of oil, gas, and coal to China. Richard, the Chinese government is putting its foot down. Again, Trump keeps talking about, we're talking to China. We want to talk to China. We're negotiating with China. Whenever he says that, or at least when he initially said it, the stock market started to go way up again because big investors, big banks, international investors know what the impact could be of an international trade war between the U.S. and China. And the Chinese turn around the next day and say, actually, we're not going to talk. We're not going to talk until the U.S. cancels its tariffs as a starting point. So the Chinese are saying it's a precondition. Now, who knows what's going on behind the scenes? Maybe there are some talks, but the Chinese are taking a pretty firm position. They're orienting their population to get ready for some economic hardship. I was looking at Lloyd's, the insurer for international shipping. Cargo ships carrying freight from China were down 2/3, 65% in April, and they expect within a few weeks the cargo ships from China are going to be absolutely empty. Anyway, this is the beginning of a longer battle. China's not where it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, certainly 50 years ago. The Chinese people are standing up.
Well, I think as many of these things are, this is another sign, another piece of evidence, another milestone in a changing world economy. And I don't think there's now any basis not to see it other than the willful denial because it's a scary proposition. Here's what I mean. The whole world is watching. The United States is playing its ultimate economic card in this game, which is we will cut you off of our market. We will cut you off of buying things you need here, and then you'll really have to bend. Now, for many years and for many countries, this worked. And now we have an example where it doesn't work, where the country in question is too big, too well developed, has got too many allies to whom it can turn, and so it doesn't have to knuckle under And it's not pretending to knuckle under. It's in anything standing up and saying, nope, I cannot exaggerate what this means to every country in Asia, Africa, Latin America. The United States had an empire. When the British Empire faded, the American Empire stepped up and took its place. It organized its empire differently. It didn't have colonies the way India was a colony of Britain, but it had economic subordination of everybody else in the world. And partly this was because coming out of World War II, we were such an important economic unit in a wrecked global economic system. Remember, the war destroyed Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan. I mean, we were the only ones left who came out of the war stronger economically than we had been in the Depression before the war. So the reality was we were crucial. Europe couldn't have rebuilt itself after the war without the Marshall Plan, which was money we lent to the Europeans, which they then used to buy the goods from the United States with which they rebuilt, and on and on and on. All of that is now over. It took a long time, 70 years roughly, for all of that to fade away. And Americans lived high off the hog most of that time. The dollar became the global currency. Everybody had dollars in their central bank as the support alongside of gold for their own currencies, and on and on. And what you're seeing now is the world having become more important relative to the United States, and no country demonstrates that more than China, which is the great success story of economic development of the last half of a century. And they are coming into their own. That's why it's China, as opposed to somebody else, taking this step. I know it's a different situation, but I would urge people. The United States, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, moved NATO over to the Russian border, from the Baltic states in the north through Poland all the way down to Bulgaria. The last step in that process was the NATOification of Ukraine. And the Russians, backed by the Chinese, said no. They would have liked to say no before in Poland or in the Czech Republic or in Slovenia. It doesn't matter. They couldn't. Now they can. You have to ask yourself the question, what happened? Well, the Russians are part of the BRICS. The Russians are now a close ally with China. Mr. Putin has said that they feel themselves to be a Eurasian country or an Asian pivot, whatever you want to call it, but they're standing up militarily, and the world is noticing they can. And now the Chinese are doing it economically, and the world is noticing they can. Look, China has spent a lot of money and a lot of time building the BRICS alliance. The United States has a worse relationship to its allies now than it's had in a century. There was just an election in Canada where a candidate came from behind because he was the big anti-Trump, and the other guy, not so much. Okay, there you see it. And you're going to be seeing that kind of thing all over the place. And that's how you have to understand what the Chinese are doing. They used to buy soybeans from the United States. They will now get their soybeans from Brazil. No problem. They used to get their energy, as you listed it, in small part, never a big part, from the United States. Well, guess what Canada is going to do? One of the major exports of Canada is energy. And where does it go? To the United States. And what is Mr. Trump threatening? A tariff. Okay, China will now go to the Canadians, and they will have a marriage of convenience between the two. Each of them will escape the problem of the United States by working together. And let me drive home a very, very important point. This is going to be very difficult to undo. These are relationships that are built up. These are understandings. These are schedules of what ship will be loaded up with what, going from where to where. You don't unravel that overnight. And these relationships, a good number of them will not come back to the United States, even if Mr. Trump were to cancel the trade war at some point in the near future. That's what's happening as we've talked about it. The United States, in the quest to control its empire, is becoming isolated. And for the United States, that is the opposite of running an empire. And Americans are going to feel that everywhere and starting right in their pocketbook.
Richard, there's an element of, I want to get your opinion on this. There's an element of nostalgia in Trump's economic program. I mean, nostalgia is kind of could be used for big parts of the Trump Make America Great Again, meaning at some earlier time, it was wonderful and great. But there's nostalgia about economic policies too. And I want to get your thought about how much this nostalgia or this ideology of the Trump team is driving this, or whether there are other factors or overlapping factors. And here's what I mean. In 1913, the 16th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was passed, which gave Congress the power to raise a federal income tax and a federal tax on corporations. Before 1913, about 95% of the federal revenue, the revenue available to the federal government, came from tariffs. And Trump is now calling his tariffs policy the external revenue service, not the internal revenue service. Well, the IRS was also born in 1913 after the passage of the 16th Amendment. So it's this notion that you can get rid of corporate taxes and taxes on individuals, which of course is most important for rich people who have a higher tax rate, much lower than it was after World War II, but a higher tax rate. In a way, it feels like this is this billionaire fantasy that if you can go back to tariffs nostalgically, a nostalgia fantasy, if you can go back to tariffs as the primary source of raising federal revenue, then rich people won't have to pay any taxes and corporations won't pay any taxes. So that's one possibility. And then the second possibility, and this is something you alluded to in our show last week, is that when the U.S. began neoliberalism and sent its factories and enterprises overseas in order to pay workers much lower wages than were paid by U.S. workers, the idea was it would create super profits for the corporations. And it did. They got very, very rich. But the impact was all these factories, all this technology went overseas. And now you have a situation where these third world or global south countries where the technology was exported to have not only they haven't been content to simply remain as assemblers at the lowest end of the production process, but have accumulated the technological know-how and the innovation such that they're ahead of the United States. And the tariffs are the only way to stop this sort of continuing trend. So which is it? Is it nostalgia, or is it actually from an ideological grouping within the ruling class, or is it this sort of imposed sort of economic hardship on the United States as a consequence of the growth of other economies? And by the United States, I mean the U.S. capitalists.
Yeah, I think the basic answer is, which I know is not satisfying, is it's both of these things. It's not an either or, it's not a singular storyline to tell. Part of Mr. Trump is unquestionably a nostalgic notion that there was a time, somewhere, somehow, when businesses could keep their profits because it's so bitter to have to part with the taxes you have to pay. And maybe even for the mass of people who can also fantasize how nice it would be if that tax was not withheld from my check every week when I come home from my job. Sure, everybody wants not to have to pay taxes, but everybody also wants the government to do all kinds of things for the society, which are necessary for a modern standard of living. Now, here comes the punchline. If you're willing to sacrifice the mass of your people to live below the modern standard of living, well, then you can indulge your nostalgia. You can actually do what you just outlined. Cut your income tax on corporations, the profits tax, cut your income tax on individuals, shift the burden of taxation onto trade. That's no different, really, from what a number of the most conservative states in the United States have done. They've eliminated their personal income tax. New Hampshire is famous for that. Texas, I believe, doesn't have one, and so on. What did they do? They put the burden of taxes not on tariffs, because they're not allowed to do that by our law, but they did it in sales taxes. So here, I live in New York City. I have to pay a sales tax to the state of New York, and on top of that, another sales tax to the city of New York. And I have that on top of income taxes to both of them. So we are taxed like crazy here. We don't want any more. You can get that from every one of my neighbors all day long, every day. And they are tempted to vote for politicians who say something, whether they do it or not. But let's be sure we understand what that meant. Sales taxes are regressive. You pay the same 10% on that bottle of bottled water, whether you're Mr. Rockefeller or you're you and me. We pay, there's no effort to make you pay according to your capacity to pay. The way income taxes usually are set up, they are progressive. So what you're really doing is shifting the burden of government onto the average people, everybody paying the same, which is an immense gift to the richest amongst us and to the corporations who are exempt from doing sales taxes. So putting it on tariffs, that's a sales tax. A tariff is a kind of sales tax. It's not a sales tax on a domestic produced object. It's a sales tax on an imported object. But it's a sales tax, and so it becomes a burden on the mass of people. When Mr. Trump talks, it's very carefully choreographed that he only talks about the income tax versus the tariff. He can't even dare tell people what is a simple mathematical truth, that a tariff is a sales tax. It's a regressive tax on everybody, pays the same percentage, which is not what the income tax does. And you know who'll be, ironically, the biggest victim? Medium and small businesses. They can't pass on the tax they will have to pay the way big corporations often can. So the bottom line is, it is a nostalgia, but it is also, and I have to tell you this, it is a rational process for corporations and the rich who have always wanted to shift the burden of tax. Last way to show you this, you remind us correctly that at the very beginning of the 20th century, the U.S. Congress passed the laws that created the modern income tax. And if you go back and you look at it, the initial income tax only affected the richest 2% of the American people. It was a tax on the rich, no question about it. And the rich hated it and denounced it because of that. When they failed to prevent that, and by the way, the income tax idea was old, had been around quite a while before it got passed. But when they lost that battle and they now had to pay it, they changed their strategy. And what they did over the rest of the 20th century was change the rules on who was subject to the income tax. So it went from the super rich to everybody else. We democratized the one thing. The taxes, they became on everybody, which is why we have now the reaction of the corporations. Well, now let's get rid of the whole income tax, a very clever tactic, because now that average people have to pay it, they too can be won over to vote for a politician who says, I'm going to get rid of the, as you put it, internal revenue source and do it on an external one. Not understanding that in the end, the tariffs will be moved by every business able to do it onto the mass of us as a sales tax. And once again, one class benefits and the other class pays the bill.
Very important framing. People should understand the tariffs as a regressive sales tax are, in fact, a form of class warfare.
Yep.
Launched by Trump on behalf of billionaires, very rich people, and corporations. I want to go in our last couple minutes, Richard, to back to the historical element of this. And I mentioned 1913, the 16th Amendment was passed that allowed Congress, gave Congress the authority to pass income tax and corporate tax, tax on profits. That's also the year the Federal Reserve was created. That was also the year right before World War I. Now, the U.S. entered World War I late in the day. It was the latecomer. It came in 1918, just as the war was almost over. But the U.S. kind of financed the major players in the war during it. And the U.S. economy took off, and farm products needed to, feed the soldiers in Europe in particular. Farm profits took off, but they took off because the farmers, a lot of small farmers, took out big loans. And then after the war, the loans had to be paid back. The farm export was less robust, and they couldn't do it. And there was a big movement in the United States in the 1920s, which was considered the booming 20s. Well, it wasn't booming for small farmers. Many of them got wiped out. The small farmers became a lobby, along with others, demanding the reimposition of tariffs to protect U.S. agriculture. And then industry got in and said, well, there should be tariffs to protect U.S. industry from foreign exports, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, a tariff bill worked its way through Congress, and it got passed. And then the other parts of the world, the other countries of the world, passed reciprocal tariffs. This was in the 1920s, the booming 20s. Well, the booming 20s, Richard, ended in 1929 with the massive Wall Street crash, the stock market crash on Wall Street, that precipitated a global economic depression unlike any contraction ever. What was the impact, from your point of view, of this sort of imposition of a trade war in the mid or late 1920s on that subsequent crash on Wall Street?
Well, the basic answer that economic historians have given for quite a while now is that it was a disaster. It was a major contributor to the crash, not so much to the particular crash itself, but to the inability of the system to recover from the crash, to take the steps. And the reason they didn't was the lack of coordination. They had all become enemies of one another. was called Beggar My Neighbor. You took the steps to protect yourself that hurt your neighbor. Your neighbor couldn't sell to you because you had made a tariff war. So they punched back and built a tariff war around their yard so you couldn't access them. Everybody was at everybody else's throats. Everybody had readjusted their supply chains and everything else to deal with a nationalist focus. So when the system as a whole hit a real speed bump, everybody was on their own. Everybody tried to get out of the Depression at the expense of everybody else because that's what they've been practicing for throughout the 20s, and that was a disaster. That lack of coordination meant that, every country was on their own. They couldn't handle it. By the way, that is a very dangerous foresight about today. If you have a world in which we are no longer cooperating, even the way we did under the aegis of a U.S. empire, when we're now having trade wars and hot wars and who knows what kind of tariff wars, you're recreating the nationalist focus, the lack of cooperation, which will be what we need if the recession that Goldman Sachs and Bank of America are telling us coming down the pike real close, if it hits, we're going to be real sorry that we don't have that coordination, or maybe we'll see a rapid recognition to put aside all of that noise and make a deal so we can survive together.
Yeah. As we end, Richard, I want to recommend to our audience, look up Beggar Thy Neighbor, where the main policy of the different capitalist governments was to export unemployment to somebody else.
Right.
And that created a massive economic crisis. And a few years later, the victory of fascism in Germany. I mean, it's not just because of that, but certainly had a big impact. Anyway, we're out of time. Richard Wolff is the co-founder of the organization Democracy at Work. He's the author of many books, including Understanding Capitalism, which is available at democracyatwork.info. You're listening to The Socialist Program. We'll be back tomorrow.